Welcome to China Institute's first public program this fall, Why Confucius Matters Today, kicking off our In Search of China's Soul series to discuss topics like Confucius and Confucianism in relation to the world we are living today. I'm Shenzhan Liao, head of the School of Chinese Studies at China Institute. I want to start by thanking our audience for joining us today, our members and supporters to make programs like this possible. As the head of the school, I also want to welcome many students studying Chinese language and culture at China Institute, as well as other places, to this program. It truly provides a great opportunity to join lively discussions with experts and be part of a passionate learning community. For K-12 educators in New York State, this program is eligible for professional development hours, thanks to our partner, Project Develop Chinese Language Teachers at New York University. Today's program will start with Professor Zu-yan Chen, our speaker and expert on Confucianism, a SUNY Distinguished Teaching Professor at Binghamton University. Professor Chen is the author of 7 books and many articles on a wide range of topics on Chinese literature, history, philosophy, language pedagogy, and beyond. We are honored to have Professor Chen to this program, as well as teaching at China Institute this fall, a short course, Introduction to Confucianism, 儒学导论, starting October 7th. Following Professor Chen's talk, we are very pleased to have Zak Dychtwald. Zak is a friend of China Institute. He is the leading expert on China's youth culture. Zak will have a discussion with Professor Chen, moderated by Dinda Elliott, Director of Programs at China Institute. And because we have such a rich content and looking forward to the discussion today, this program probably will go beyond 1 hour. We're looking at around 1 hour and 15 minutes, perhaps. So without further ado, I will first turn the screen to Professor Chen. Professor Chen, could you turn on your camera, please?
Okay, I'm here. Thank you, Shenzhan and Dinda, for inviting me to give a talk to the China Institute community and the public from different states and from China. My appreciation also goes to Zak for graciously agreeing to join the conversation with me. I also would like to thank everyone here in the audience for taking the time out of your busy schedule to attend this event at 7:30 p.m. or 7:30 a.m. Today, my topic is why Confucius matters today. Let me first share my PPT. Okay, why Confucius matters today. In this mini lecture, I will do 3 things. First, I will tell you who Confucius is. Then I will introduce 2 core values of Confucianism. And finally, I will discuss the contemporary significance of Confucianism. Oh, what's going on there? Sorry about this. I think I'll show something. Let's go back to my, go back to my slides. Yeah. Okay. Confucius' dates are 551 to 479 BCE. So he lived more than 2,500 years ago. Some people asked me why Confucius' name does not sound like a Chinese name. Actually, Chinese people call him Kongzi or Confuzi, both meaning Master Kong. Confucius is Confucius' Latinized translation by Italian Catholic priests who were on mission in China in the 16th century. just give you an idea of Confucius' time because so long ago. And Confucius is about 120 years older than Plato. Of course, we know Plato. He is a Greek philosopher and founder of Western political philosophy. So in a broader sense, these two great philosophers of East and West can be considered contemporaries. Then what kind of person is Confucius? First, he is a great teacher. It is believed that he taught 3,000 students. This picture shows Confucius' temple in his hometown, Qufu. During Emperor Confucius' visit to the temple in the 17th century, he inscribed on the plate 4 characters, 万世师表, we can see here right in the middle, 万世师表, meaning exemplary teacher for 10,000 generations. So this became a popular posthumous name for Confucius. And in addition to be a great teacher, as a great teacher, the most important book that teaches Confucianism is his Analects. This book is a collection of about 500 Confucius sayings that relate to all aspects of human life and society, including moral cultivation, lifestyle, social order, and government principles. Understanding and practicing these sayings will change a person's life. Confucianism is very popular in the East Asian countries and has also widespread to other parts of the world. Confucius Analects has about 40 English translations. Confucius sayings are quoted widely, not only in China and East Asia, but also in the West countries. However, sometimes the quotation's authenticity is questionable. For example, this one has been cited widely. It reads, choose a job you love, and you will never have to work a day in your life, Confucius. However, I do not think Confucius said this. First, I didn't see this passage in the Analects. Secondly, although this saying is a wise advice, especially for college students, the content is too modern. Because during the Confucius times, there was no such a thing as to choose a job. Now we can choose to be a doctor or accountant or dancer, whatever. But at that time, the only career was to serve at the different levels of government. So choose a job would not be the topic for Confucius teaching. So we should keep this in mind, or this authenticity issue in mind, because sometimes we can even see Confucius sayings on fortune cookies. Confucius' teaching influenced the Chinese people's thoughts and lives for over 2,000 years. Some people asked if Confucianism is a religion or philosophy. To answer this question, I would like to first ask a question. What are the major differences between religion and philosophy? Religion and philosophy are overlapping in many ways, but there are at least 2 major differences. Religious people practice and perform rituals, but the philosophy students do not. A religion has a god or gods, but the philosophy does not. So Confucianism is not a religion, but a philosophy. Confucius is not a god, but a sage. He is just a nice and a wise man. In the second century BCE, Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty established Confucianism as the orthodoxy of the country. Since then, through the imperial dynasties, Confucianism was China's mainstream ideology. So now we know Confucius, who Confucius is. Let's talk about Confucianism. Confucius taught his disciples many core values, such as benevolence, or 仁 in Chinese, rightness, 义, ritual propriety, 礼, trustworthiness, 信, filial piety, 孝, uprightness, 直, and learning, 学, and many others. Today, because of the limited time, I will only introduce 2 core values and discuss their contemporary significance. The first core value I would like to introduce is 学 or learning. Now let's read Confucius' saying. Most of passages in the Analects start with the master said, because this book was made by his students. And it reads, the master said, to learn and then to practice at due times, is this also a pleasure? This is the first sentence of the first passage of the first chapter in the Analects. So every Chinese knows this passage. According to Confucius, learning is not something imposed on us, but we simply should take a learning process as a joy. Only when we think in this way, we will study conscientiously, effectively, and happily. In Confucius' thought, the essence of learning is to learn to be a good human. Confucius wanted to raise all-round people who have high moral, rich knowledge, and practical skills, similar to the requirements of our general education. Confucius' teaching about learning affected Chinese people through generations. There are many stories about diligent learning, especially learning from adversity, learning through adversity. Let me tell you a story about Fan Zhongyan. Fan Zhongyan was a firm Confucian scholar in the Song dynasty. His father was an official, but when Fan Zhongyan was only 1 year old, his father died. In ancient China, women did not work, so the death of father meant the loss of family's financial resources. His mother could not raise him and had to send him to a Buddhist temple in the mountains. Fan Zhongyan did chores for the temple so he could live and study there. Fan Zhongyan did not have money, so he thought of a way to feed himself. Every day he made a pot of porridge. He let the porridge cool down and congeal. Then he cut it into 2 pieces. He ate 1 piece of his porridge cake in the morning and 1 piece in the afternoon. He also cut some pickles to small pieces to go with his porridge cakes. One boy who studied in the temple was from a rich family. Out of sympathy, once he wanted to share a nice meat dish with Fan Zhongyan. However, Fan Zhongyan turned him down with grace. Fan Zhongyan explained, "It's not that I don't like to eat delicious meat. I'm just afraid that if I try it, I will lose courage to eat my porridge cakes." After a few years, Fan Zhongyan learned a great deal of knowledge. He participated in the civil service examination and emerged as a top scholar in the nation. so he received the appointment in the government. Later, he rose to the position of vice prime minister. He was known as an accomplished statesman, a victorious general, and a productive writer. Even in such a high position, he lived a simple life, and he did not allow more than one meat dish at his family's dinner table. Once he wrote in the prose piece, "Be the first to worry about the nation's adversity, and the last to enjoy its prosperity." These two lines are known to all Chinese and have become a model for many. Material life could be poor, but the perseverant pursuit for knowledge and truth brings success and happiness. The second core value I would like to introduce is trustworthiness, or 信 in Chinese. Confucius said, "Speeches must be trustworthy, and action must be fruitful." Trustworthiness forms a glue that binds social relationships. Given the rapid economic, social, and political changes that our society is undergoing, it is no surprise that many people prize trustworthiness so highly. Without it, the smooth functioning of government, business, and society would have quickly unraveled. Now let me tell you a story about trustworthiness. Zheng was one of the Confucius' major disciples. He enjoyed his family with his wife and a young son. One day, his wife planned to go to the market, and the son asked for going with her. Thinking that going to the market is a waste of time for the boy, the mother said, "Well, the market is no fun. You should stay at home and study." However, the son insisted and cried. Having not pacified the little boy, the mother told him, "If you stay at home, we will butcher a pig so we can eat pork at dinner." Then the son happily agreed and stayed at home to study. The mother brought some potatoes at the market and thought she will make a potato dinner. When she returned home, however, she was shocked to see that Zheng has already killed the only pig they raised. She was so astonished and dropped her basket with potatoes to the ground. She asked, "What are you doing here? Why did you kill the pig? We would save it for our New Year Eve's dinner." Zheng said, "Did you say to our son that if he does not go to the market, we will make a pork dish tonight?" "Yes, but I just wanted to fool him and make him to study at home." And Zheng then said very seriously, "Parents set models for children. If we lie today, he will lie tomorrow. If we want to raise an honest son, we should not cheat him. That's why I butchered the pig. Okay, let's make a good dinner." The wife understood and agreed. They made a delicious dish of pork with potatoes, and the three of them had a nice dinner. Their son grew up to be an honest and decent man. Because of time limit, I can only introduce these two core values. We need to move on to talking about the contemporary period, the contemporary significance of Confucianism. Since we are talking about the contemporary period, the first question is periodization, or what is the contemporary period? In English language historiography, contemporary period or contemporary history is a subset of modern history. From approximately 1945, which marks the end of World War II. One of the important phenomena that has changed the paradigm of the world since World War II is the powerful growth of many economies in East Asia. This trend started with the Japanese post-war economic miracle. With its GDP soaring from a mere 91 billion in 1965 to over 1 trillion in 1980, Japan was often called the rising sun. Japan's rise was followed by the supercharged development of Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, which were collectively labeled the four Asian tigers. These nations and areas were notable for maintaining high growth rates, 7% per year, and a rapid industrialization between the 1960s and the 1990s. The third act was staged in China. In the 3 decades from 1979 to 2010, China maintained an annual GDP growth rate of 9.9% and increased its economy size 20-fold, becoming the world's second largest economy. Called an awakening dragon, China actually awakened the people in the world, politicians and scholars included, to this East Asian economic miracle. This picture shows the Shanghai Pudong financial district. It was just a rice field 40 years ago. The Asian success stories in the economy evoked many books and articles that tried to explain the phenomena and decode their secrets. What is the central drive in the East Asian economic miracle? And what produces the underlying spirit for Asian people to excel? To answer these questions and other questions, more and more scholars have focused on the single most defining feature of East Asian societies, the legacy of Confucianism. Indeed, by any reckoning, Confucius is the most penetrating, wide-ranging, and influential philosopher in East Asia. In this mini lecture, I introduced Confucius, talked about 2 of his core values, and discussed the contemporary significance of Confucianism. Each core value is presented with Confucius sayings, or with one Confucius saying, because of time limit, and one historical story that illustrates the core value. I hope you found that these core values and sayings are meaningful, and these stories are inspiring. I also hope that you will get fresh insights on the contemporary Confucian relevance as a broader cultural phenomena, and agree that Confucianism is capable of addressing a wide range of social and political issues in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chen. That was just fascinating. And thank you for giving us that really great introduction to Confucian thinking and values. I'm Dinda Elliott, as Shenzhen said, the Director of Programs at China Institute. And it's my great pleasure now to bring Zak Dychtwald to the screen. Zak is an amazing Zhongguo Tong, who has spent many, many years in China and speaks absolutely perfect Chinese. He wrote a great book called Young China and has really become an expert on youth in China and in the course of researching his book, he, came to understand market trends among young people in China, and he then founded a market insights firm called Young China. Is that right? Yeah. So Zach, we're really thrilled to have you, talk a little bit now to share your thoughts on why Confucianism and why Confucius is relevant in China today. We've got this incredibly, modern, rapidly changing society. Are these values still relevant? So Zach's going to talk for a few minutes, and then we're all going to come back onto the screen again and have a conversation. But let me turn it over to you, Zach, and I'll come back in a few minutes.
Thanks so much, Dinda. Thank you, Professor Chen. That was I wish we had more time. I've never been able to take a full Confucian class, so maybe I will sign up with China Institute. Plug there for that wonderful course. This question of why Confucius matters today is an enormous one. And I was trying to think of a way to describe it. And I actually went back to my college days, which feels increasingly long ago. I had a wonderful professor of philosophy, or the history of philosophy, Roosevelt Montas. He actually runs the core curriculum over at Columbia. And when he was describing why Western philosophy matters for modern America and Western Europe, he used the term deeply internalized Smithism, referring, of course, to Adam Smith. What he meant by that was that, in school, in life, when we're doing business, we don't go around quoting Wealth of Nations. You don't see people tattooing portions of Smith's canon onto their arm. It's not a spiritual sect. It's not something that we find even returning to that often in our studies, but it's a set of values. It's a worldview. It's a lens through which we look at business, morality, right and wrong, the purpose of life, that has infused itself within Western culture in a way that's both undeniable and frankly inextricable. You can't disentangle Adam Smith from modern Western society. And I think there's a good corollary here, because in China today, particularly with young people, but throughout the country, Confucianism is not something that people quote every day. It's not something that is taught in class on a daily basis, though of course it is taught in class, and there's been a recent re-emphasis on it. But it is something that has seeped into every aspect of modern Chinese culture as something more nebulous than a firm set of rules, but rather it's a moral structure as well. And that sounds really vague, so I'm going to try to bring it to life with a few examples. I'm really glad that Professor Chen brought up the example of xue to start, because learning and education is really one of the fundamentals of a Confucian philosophy, and certainly what brings a lot of the Confucian countries together that Professor Chen was talking about. When we talk about the tiger economies, of course, they're known for their ascendant multi-year double-digit growth. China, of course, having the longest prolonged period of double-digit growth actually in history, since we've been measuring GDP. But there's something else that they have in common, and it is glasses prescriptions. I was trying to find this graphic that I have. It's called Myopia Utopia. There was a great study that was comparing nearsightedness, myopia rates in countries around the world. And what they found was that in the United States, myopia rates were around 40%. So about 40% of kids, when they graduated from high school, needed glasses. Germany, around 40, 45%. The UK, 38 to 43. And then you look over to East Asia and South Asia, of course, with Singapore, and that number leaps from 40 to 90. Today in China, 90% of young people suffer from nearsightedness by the time they graduate from high school. And it's not just China. If you look at South Korea, that number jumps actually to 96. Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, all Confucian education styles and systems, and all suffer from nearsightedness. What's so interesting about nearsightedness is it's something that's developed directly from the habits that we have, from the amount of time spent in a classroom with books. And, in young China, I have a few stories that bring this to life, but it wasn't uncommon in my time in China and my ongoing time in China for when the library opens at 6 a.m. to see a line of people, of college students outside of the door waiting to get in to study. You'd go into the library, there would be stacks of books, people making their small sort of study empire around them. You could, of course, see what everyone is studying. You have math, you have physics, you have philosophy. And that's where they would be all day from 6 a.m. until library closes at 10 p.m. And the university that I'm talking about in this case isn't Beida, it's not Tsinghua, it was Suzhou University, a relatively middling, although up and coming university. The students who got in were not the most prestigious throughout China, but the culture of study, the culture of focus on books, and that culture of hard work around study is something that is inseparable from Chinese education today. Many of you are aware of the Gaokao, the Chinese college entrance exam, and its primary distinguishing feature when you compare it to something like the SAT is that the SAT is included with other facets of somebody's application. If you were the captain of the cheerleader team, that's really great in the United States. In China, if you were the captain of the cheerleading team, that's really nice, but it's a waste of time. You should have been studying. Oh, you were the best piano player in all of California. That's fantastic. In China, that's a lot of hours that you could have been spending, sure, refining your piano play, but also in the room studying, in the library studying. There's a respect for hours, for time, for hard work that is directly related to the Confucian style of education and work ethic that is an inextricable part of China today. And now we can talk a little bit about tension. So what is the relevance today? Well, there's a couple of critical questions that are in direct conflict with that sort of legacy of Confucianism. One, does hard work translate to creativity? Can China create an innovation economy if it's a hard work economy? Does the ability to work hard for long hours and follow directions from the teacher, answer correct bubbles on a test, translate to the ability to create the next Google? We're seeing in China today that question is being answered to a certain degree. The answer is, well, kind of, yeah. You have, China has more emergent tech unicorns than most any other country in the world, with the exception of the United States. The question is, how sustainable is that? And does that make a young person happy? I think one of the more interesting trends is you have people my age. I'm 30, which I'm going to have to write something on middle-aged China soon with the rising years. But you have young people my age in China starting to have kids. And you have a lot of young people who went through that Confucian style of education, who went through the Gaokao, asking themselves, is this what I want my child to focus on? Do I want them to go through that again? And so that tension, I think of it as the tension between tradition, really Confucian values, even if they have somewhat dissipated into something more amorphous today, the want to study, the need to focus, working hard for long hours, that eat bitter mentality. There are areas where that tradition is at odds with modernity, the need to be creative, the want to not just work hard, but also enjoy life, to live a more well-rounded life. I think of those as two tectonic plates grinding against each other. Now, in some places, they slide into one another seamlessly, no friction. In other places, there's a little bit of conflict. The second area that I'm going to bring up today, and then I'm looking forward to some really tough questions from the audience today, and of course from Dinda, is this question of xiao, which was another of the characters that Professor Chen brought up. Xiao and xiaoshun translates to filial piety. I really don't like the translation filial piety, because I would never say to a friend, hey, I'm going to head home this weekend and go be filially pious to my mom and dad. But in China, it's far more conversational. It's something that people are accustomed to. Filial piety is baked into the Chinese system today because it's the traditional retirement system. In China, as recently as 1950, the family structure was sort of set up like a pyramid. You had a lot of young people, between 5 and 6 kids per family, and relatively few old people. frankly. In 1950, the average life expectancy in China was about 40, a little bit less. And so the system of retirement was called 反哺模式. It means the return and feed model. Parents would raise their kids. The kids would then look after their parents into old age. Of course, preference for boys there, because boys didn't marry out of the family. They were meant to look after their parents into old age, which of course translates later with the one-child policy into selective abortions and some of the gender inequalities we see today. But the retirement system was explicitly about children. Now, fast forward to 1980 and the one-child policy, and China's big demographic boom, which was happening between 1950 and 1980, was followed by the world's biggest demographic bust. And so now you see China's demographic pyramid, its population pyramid, beginning to turn itself on its head. So at the base of that pyramid, you have China's young people, you have the youth today. And on top of that, you have 4 grandparents for every 2 parents for every 1 child. Think of that downward pyramid like a funnel. It's a funnel for resources. It's a funnel for food and love. It's a funnel for attention. In the late 1980s, there was a psychologist who expected that this would be he coined the term the little emperors, people who were spoiled rotten by an excess of love, attention, resources, etc. It's also a funnel for pressure to get ahead, pressure to compete, pressure to get into a good school, pressure on the college market, on the PhD market, on the job market, on the marriage market. Something that used to be dissipated around 5 or 6 children suddenly is just angled down at 1. And on top of that pressure is this pressure of looking after your parents. Now, China doesn't really have religion. We could debate that, and maybe we should a little bit later, but it does have family. And this idea of 孝顺 is almost synonymous with just being good. Being a good person more or less means being a good child. And so you have young people who have inherited that sense of what it means to be good, what it means to be 孝顺, filially pious, who have a tremendous want to look after their parents and grandparents, coupled with an almost complete economic inability to do so, because there's just 1 child at the bottom of that pyramid. That's a very tenuous amount of weight to try to support. And so there are a number of issues like this around marriage, around children, around work, around hierarchy in the workplace, around hierarchy in the government. By the way, there's a real reason that the government is supporting Confucianism in a more material way now. There's a usefulness to a population who is steeped in Confucianism that, just like different philosophies and religions, there's always sort of a political factor there. But that friction between modernity and tradition grinds on this young generation. And what I think is so fascinating and is sort of an open question right now, where do those tectonic plates, again, tradition and modernity, where do they set? What does modern Chinese identity look like? How do we incorporate tradition into the 21st century and beyond? What's so cool and cool in an academic sense, but I think everyone here probably can share in that interest, is that modern Chinese identity is being created, it's being decided, it's being negotiated in real time today. So I don't have the answer today, but it's something that we're seeing unfold. There are tensions and sort of smooth incorporations that we're seeing unfold today in real time. And my guess is 10 years from now, if I'm still invited back, Professor Chen and I can revisit the question, why does Confucius matter today? Because a lot of those questions will have been decided in far more, not conclusive, but definite terms. Thank you.
So thank you, Zach. That was a lot of food for thought. Professor Chen, let me call you back onto the screen as well. And let's have a discussion about that. I mean, I guess first, Professor Chen, let me give you a chance to kind of, just in a few minutes, respond to what you heard from Zach. And then I have some more specific questions, but, what are your thoughts about, what Zach was sharing about the relevance of Confucianism to today?
Okay, so I think Zach studies young China, and I study older China. So we really can have a very good discussion. I think Zach, you talked about learning and talk about filial piety. I think very well, and you really is a young China expert. Okay, and so the filial piety, I think, is a good question for a good issue for young people now. And you talked about this downward pyramid family mode, right? And so lots of pressure and tension for young people now. Yeah, I think I just wanted to add something old, okay? And some good news and bad news for these young people. The bad news first. When a student asked Confucius about filial piety, and Confucius said, if there's food, you let your parents to eat. And if there are chores, you young guys do it, right? And do you think this is a filial piety? This is a rhetorical question. So the answer is no, right? So no. So then he explained, he further said, Confucius said two words. So 色难, so means the most difficult is your facial expression. So young people need to have a good expression to show their love and happiness when they serve their parents. So Confucius set a bar for filial piety very high, actually. So
that makes it very tough. That makes it so tough for kids.
Right. So therefore, they will serve for parents or grandparents even more, but still need to be very happy, right?
They'll have a smile on their face, right?
Not just cook them for them, right? You eat, right? But so I think this is actually, Confucius lived 2,500 years ago, but these words still have a realistic impact, right? And so now good news. Good news is that Confucius always take a mutual and a reciprocal approach for defining and interpersonal relationship. So for example, about filial piety, he emphasized the filial piety, that's for sure, but he also said 父慈子孝, means a kind father and a filial son. So this is a kind of mutual and reciprocal. So, and actually many Chinese parents do very well, right? In this regard, they help their children, especially help them raise their children's children, grandchildren. So, this downward pyramid, there are problems, but also there are advantages for young people. I think nowadays quite many, parents take care of grandparents and until they are very aged. So this pyramid also has the other side, and also filial piety also has both sides according to Confucius' original words.
Well, I'd like to dig down a little bit. I'm so glad you mentioned relationships, Professor Chen, because it seems like my understanding of Confucian thinking is very oversimplified, I know, but he did think a lot about hierarchies and relationships, the proper relationships between people. And again, to sort of dig into a little deeper into, Zach, what you were talking about, the sort of tensions and the struggle between that kind of thinking and modernity. I wanted to ask, so, arguably a modern technology-driven society really has to rely on rule of law and not relationships. Rule of law has to be more important than relationships. You could make that argument anyway. Yeah. So I'm just wondering, is there a fundamental tension between Confucian ideas and a so-called modern society?
I think this is a very good question, or a very challenging question, right? About hierarchy, right? In the modern period. I think for this, first we need to know Confucius did promote or advocate the hierarchy. But we should know in what kind of situation he did this. Confucius lived in the so-called springs and autumns period. And that time, there was a nominal king of the Zhou dynasty, but China was actually divided into dozens of states. So these states head, or their kings and dukes, they didn't listen to the order of the real king of the Zhou dynasty at all. And they fought with each other. And in these states, many ministers and generals murdered their state king or dukes, and in order to usurp the throne. And altogether during this period, spring and autumn period, 36 state kings and dukes were murdered. So this is a very serious situation. So at the two levels, they didn't listen to their upper level, and their subordinates murdered them. So then Confucius they thought this is a bigger problem for the country, for society. So he emphasized this kind of hierarchy. Everybody should observe the social order. But I think more importantly is the Confucius approach. I think I just mentioned. He actually always uses this kind of mutual and reciprocal approach to define interpersonal relations. In this hierarchy issue, he also did this because the most important interpersonal relations during that time is the king or the sovereign and his ministers, right? And Confucius said, when once people asked his students asked him about this kind of relationship, and he said, 君使臣以礼，臣使君以忠. So it means a sovereign should treat his ministers with ritual propriety, and a minister should serve his sovereign with loyalty. So it's mutual, right? Not only one side. And also his more famous saying in this regard is a very strange phrase, 君君臣臣父父子子. So 4 doubled words, and just take the first double word as an example. It can be translated, treat a sovereign like a sovereign. Usually treat it like this, okay? Treat a sovereign like a sovereign. So it means kind of a hierarchy, right? And this reading is a verb object structure. However, classical Chinese grammar is very flexible. So this word 君君 has another reading, which is a subject verb structure. And in that reading, it can be translated as a sovereign should act like a sovereign. Mm-hmm. So you see both sides, 2 characters. You can say a minister should treat a sovereign like a sovereign, right? So it means respect him. But the other way is a sovereign should act like sovereign, because it means he should be a good king or a good leader. So if we understand it in both ways, then the relationship also is reciprocal. And if we only emphasizing one side, I think many people did this. I think probably some times in this long history, some people, especially the ruling class members, wanted to use Confucianism to their advantage, right? So they only side one side. Yeah. And this is a kind of misinterpretation or distortion of Confucianism. So this shows that the study of a text is so important, and we need to learn Confucianism comprehensively and thoroughly. And I hope this helps our understanding of the hierarchy issue.
So 2 things are so fascinating that you just said, many things, but 2 jumped out to me. One is that context is incredibly important.
Yeah,
and
right.
the time in which Confucius was writing about this stuff for God's sake, it was the warring states. And of course, he was trying to bring some hierarchy and appropriate relationships to bring peace to the land. But the second thing is the sort of the beauty of classical Chinese leaves it open to many different interpretations. And that, you know, different various dynasties and various emperors have interpreted those texts in whatever way they wanted to, would be useful to them.
Yeah, right. You summarized it very well. I think context and the text, both are very important.
Right, fascinating. So Zach, did you want to add anything to that, or should I jump ahead to the next one?
Let's jump ahead.
Okay, great. Okay, so the next one, I mean, I again, you know, Professor Chen, there's a great debate among historians and political scientists over what Confucius actually meant in his writings, just as you say. So when you study the texts, do you think that Confucian philosophy is anti-democratic? Did Confucius advocate for intellectuals and officials to speak truth to power? Did he think it was the responsibility of a junzi to speak the truth? And is there room in Confucian values for some kind of pluralistic approach to government? Or, you know, would Confucius have supported democracy and freedom of the press? Or was his thinking more rigid in terms of the idea of the enlightened emperor having full power? So
Yeah, so this is another challenging question. And
I want you to jump in too, Zach, on this one.
Yeah, right, right.
You know, I know, not that you will interpret what Confucius thought, but Zach, you can talk a little bit about how Confucian thinking has helped shape the way they view government, the role of government, and that kind of thing. But go ahead, Professor Chen, first.
Okay, so I think, this is a very important question, right? I think actually Confucius promoted democracy. Okay, there are a few reasons. First, at the Confucius time, there were another important ism, okay, called legalism.
Yes.
And these two schools are opposite to each other. And Confucianism promoted virtue, and the legalists promoted the law. And the legalists used strict laws and severe punishment to control people and establish dictatorship. And they were very successful because there was the first emperor of Qin, right? And he adopted legalism, and he defeated the other 6 states and unified China. When he unified China, he almost immediately burned the Confucius books and buried the Confucius scholars alive. So it's clear that Confucianism is on the opposite side of dictatorship. Right? And secondly, we should really look into Confucius' values. Right? The most important core value of Confucianism is benevolence. Right? And the essence of benevolence is to love people. Confucius said, 仁者爱人, means benevolence means to love people. And he also said, 己所不欲，勿施于人 is the most important guidelines for people for practice for whole life. And it means do not impose on others that you don't wish for yourself. And this is the same as the golden rule in the Western philosophy. So loving people is the foundation of democracy. And also, of course, that time he will not say we should have an election, everybody have a one vote, right? So but loving people is a foundation. Thirdly, Confucius' idea for the ideal society and the country is 和而不同. He said 和而不同 means harmony but not conformity. So it means people can keep their own ideas, but they still get along in harmony. So this is also a trait of democracy. This is Confucius' ideal word. He said 世界大同, right? This 同, right? But still this 同 is 和而不同. Right? And So this is a trait of democracy. And lastly, I think you raised a very good question, Dinda. And if Confucius encouraged scholars or officials to stand up, right, against the emperor or whoever had a big power. Actually, because of Confucius' encouragement, throughout the Chinese history, there are many Confucius scholars and officials. They dared to stand up to authority, even to the emperor, when they saw something is wrong. For example, like Hai Rui of the Ming Dynasty, and he submitted his memorial. He's a Confucian scholar. He submitted his memorial to the emperor Jia of the Ming Dynasty, in which he criticized this emperor very strongly, directly. And before submitting this letter or memorial, he already made a coffin for himself. So he thought that he would be executed. So after he submitted the memorial, he was immediately arrested and put into jail. But later this emperor died first, so he was finally released. But otherwise, he would be executed. So I think Confucius should not take the blame for anti-democracy. By the way, I think because Confucianism was a mainstream idea for about 2,000 years. So there are two very possible scenarios. One is when country is in peace, and then or in good times, many people, mainly as just mentioned, mainly these ruling class members would use Confucianism to their advantage. And the other scenario is when country had problems, then Confucianism would be an easy target of a blame game, I think, because it's so important.
Interesting. And so we won't go into this tonight because there's no time, but it's so interesting that you mentioned Hai Rui, because of course, in Chinese politics and history, people always refer back to ancient history, et cetera. And of course, Hai Rui, that story reemerged at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. And
right.
but we'll save that for another time. But Zach, I'm curious to hear, how you think, that question, sort of democracy, democratic thinking internalized in terms of the Smith, Adam Smith foundations of our culture, and Confucian being the foundations of Chinese culture. How do people view the role of their government? People talk in terms of modern day questions. We're told again and again that Chinese people in China tend to be less concerned about privacy, that kind of thing. They tend to be more trusting of the government, whatever. So I'm just curious as to how you think, what's going on in the minds of Chinese people.
So the distance between legalism and democracy is vast.
Yeah.
And Confucianism is not diametrically opposed to legalism, though it was competing with it at the time. And Hai Rui is a wonderful example, but it's not an example of somebody who is trying to establish a democratic republic.
Right.
And I think there's something that we want to believe, which is that sort of the path of history is inevitable, and that a modern nation also must be a democracy. And there might be some truth to that, and we might see it play out. But young people in China aren't predisposed to believing that that's the path to prosperity, and are becoming a little bit less so, which I know is disappointing. This is the point I get pushback on the most, because it sounds like I'm advocating for this. I'm not. I'm describing a reality, which is that Confucianism is not at odds with dictatorship if the dictator is benevolent. Yeah. And I think this is the key issue that we very rarely talk about. Xi Jinping is not seen as necessarily benevolent is not, people aren't, that's not the first word that people immediately think of, but they do praise his efficacy. And particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, that efficacy, that ability to lead, to rule. And then of course, the less favorable elements of the political party are less obvious in China because of a strong propaganda core. There is already a predisposition to accepting a leader who's more capable in China than other places in the world. And I absolutely believe that Confucianism has a role in that.
Yeah.
Those hierarchies we talked about before, those hierarchies, as they're different than the West, are about distance and stature. One of the first things that study abroad students talk about is the awkwardness of disagreeing with their teacher, which of course, if you're in a 20-person lecture at one of these liberal arts schools is the point. And so bridging that distance, which in Western culture is meant to be smaller. It's like, oh, you can kind of have a beer with your boss and start using their first name, or maybe you'll do the same with your teacher. In China, that distance is far greater, and they're seen as utility there. And so what I look at today is two things. On one hand, you look at young people who from China look out at the rest of the world, and particularly after these 2 years, they look at what, and this I would call war times, frankly. To use Professor Chen's terminology, I think it's a great point. We all know that governments around the world use war to try to build unity. China's response to COVID-19, its war on COVID, which I think is totally fair to consider, has created an impression of efficacy, particularly when you compare to the government systems around the world, particularly, frankly, the United States. And now keep in mind, it's not like most people are living in the United States and experiencing it, but they are seeing the numbers. And again, those numbers serve as a little bit as a morbid, and I hate to say this, but scoreboard in terms of which government is keeping their people safe, which government is having the economy open. What cost does that come at? The cost is clear. And it's not like people are under the illusion that they're the same amount of freedoms from China as the US, as Britain, as Germany, as whatever. But when many places around the world are still closed down and China's been open since July of 2020, it does suggest to a lot of people, and again, we could counter argument all we want, but by and large, the impression is it's because leadership is doing a firm but effective job.
Fascinating. So let's take some questions from the audience. We're already at the hour point, but I think let's keep going for 15 more minutes. So 2 people in the audience have asked similar questions about, and actually I'll preface this by saying what we've been watching recently in China with the government's banning of after-school tutoring companies, right? This is, I guess, Confucianism on steroids, right? I mean, people are so desperate to have their children study, and the government has gotten concerned that it's, I think, not so much about studying too much, but rather about a fairness issue. But anyway, the 2 people in the audience are asking about, do you think there's an emerging reaction among young people against traditional values of hard study and hard work when you look at the Tongping phenomenon, this sort of lying flat phenomenon that we've read about in the New York Times, and that is this new trend in China? Firstly, maybe explain a little bit what that Tongping thing is, and then, tell us, do you think it is a reaction, sort of enough, we don't want this kind of pressure anymore?
Sure. So Tongping is a word that has sort of caught fire on the Chinese web. It literally means lying flat. And it's used to describe a reaction to overwork, overstudy, overpressure, too much of that grind that I was describing a little bit earlier is really defining of youth in China. And in short, I would say the answer is yes, but I don't know that it's a reaction to Confucianism. The crackdown on after-school education was in part because of this fairness issue. There was an equal understanding that education is the path forward in China, but access to the best education was increasingly out of reach for the average person. And we say a lot of bad things about the Chinese government. They're very well incentivized, though, to understand what their populace needs. And so I think of it as you have a consumer class and you have a political class. The consumer class is, of course, the one that most business people love to talk about because they buy the Hermes, the after-school tutoring. They really drive the consumer economy that has so many business people and journalists even around the world kind of frothing. But there is a class that has not been able to engage in that level of consumption that could still create political dissent. And so trying to create that fairness is something that we're seeing within China across the board. Now, I skirted your question a little bit, which is tongping. I think of tongping and the lying flat as sort of the perfect silent protest against this overpressured project of childhood in China, which is this study until you drop. Don't do any after-school sports because you should be studying for the Gaokao. You have to get into the best master's program. You have to get into the best PhD program. You have to get the best job. And now you're even seeing in these big tech companies, you have to work 996, which means 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., six days a week. It's now being loosely regulated. There's this feeling of never-ending grind. This feeling that you're always in competition in China, that young people are like, not everyone, but many are starting to think, is this what a life is for? This eat bitter mentality of more work, longer work, outwork the competition is something that was defining of the older generations in China. They were moving from subsistence to existence, moving up that Maslow's hierarchy of needs so that the next generation can have a better life. The next generation is sort of looking around being like, hey, we're here, where's our better life? And so the joke goes, the older generation ate bitter so the younger generation can eat hot pot. Sometimes moving from a big city to a smaller city means that, yeah, you're grinding a little bit less, but you'll have a higher quality of life. All of these quality of life questions are embodied in this lying flat sort of quiet revolution. I would say it's a very quiet revolution. I think whenever you hear something like this, and particularly revolution used with the word in China, everyone is sort of waiting with bated breath for overthrow. This isn't a sign of that, but it is a sign of a certain amount of fed up, as well as a question of what's a life for? When can I enjoy myself? Maybe I'll just enjoy myself now.
So I guess this is a question for Professor Chen. Somebody is saying that, so Confucius has a lot to say about rites, rituals, rules, and customs, and to follow etiquette as laid out in the Li Ji represents one's harmonious interaction with society. But the question is, what about the creation of these systems, legal, social, conventional, and customary laws? The American legal systems interpret laws differently based on different court cases. Would the same kind of thing apply to traditional or modern Chinese law?
Okay, yeah, good question. But may I just respond to the first question a little bit? Okay.
Yeah, sure.
So you mentioned tongping this issue, right? And also I agree with Zak's evaluation of this kind of overstudying, overworking for young people, right? And it really had a lot of bad side effects. Students learned every day, worked every day to midnight or even longer. And then, of course, they have like 90% of myopia rate, right? And also then, if they cannot really compete very well, then it's just tongping, right? They're lying flat. And the result was not good. And also like some teachers, they don't teach very well at school, but they're focusing on like making money after school. You know? So this I think should be changed, this kind of situation. And by the way, I also heard one thing changes, I think is good. The textbook will be changed too, and they will add more classical Chinese literature masterpieces, and including the first grade textbook will including Confucius analects passages. So they will start to learn Confucianism in first grade, by the way. So I come back to your question about the legal system.
Yeah.
I think, Confucianism is, first of all, Confucianism is a mainstream ideology for about 2,000 years throughout the imperial dynasties. But it's not really a state ideology now, right? And so for like policy issues, regulation issues, I think mainly is because will be made by other isms, right? Not to Confucianism. Confucianism mainly promote people's moral and ethic. So then, actually, not really about concrete policies and regulations.
Right. So another question from the audience, very interesting, is what would Confucius say about feminism?
Feminism, okay.
I definitely want you both to answer this one. And Zach, you can talk about the sort of, feminist movement. Go ahead.
Yeah, because he's from 2,500 years ago. So that time, the whole Chinese society, women stayed at home. They didn't have a right for education, right? They didn't go out for social life. So Confucius is no exception, I think. So he said something, so then needed to be twittered, I think, for nowadays. So we cannot really use a modern lens to look at a person's words, ideas 2,500 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Totally agree. I think this is, to put it bluntly, he'd be very against it. It would disrupt a lot of the social structures that he was establishing. But he was establishing those at a time where those were more alongside the norm, and he was just formalizing or codifying something, giving it a little bit more structure to something that was already broadly accepted. Most historical figures would not live up to modern moral standards, and Confucius is no exception. I think it would be interesting to think, that there's a Machiavellian edge to a lot of what Confucius describes, which is he's not about good or bad. There's a certain amount of does it work, and it would be interesting to reconsider that functional element and how incredibly dramatic modern Chinese women have been sort of reinventing the country, the impact on the economy, the impact on social values today. It would be interesting to see what Confucius would see and change based on what he's observing. But you're also, and the question, feminism in China does bump up against Confucianism often. It's true that 2,500 years ago, men were supposed to earn money and sort of support his parents. Women were married out. It was 嫁出去的妇女泼出去的水, the idea that a married out woman was like spilled water. The concept being is that she no longer nourishes the family tree, which of course directly translates in today in at least 80s and 90s around these which gender was preferred in a one-child family. One of the great tensions between tradition and modernity is for women, you're absolutely supposed to get married and have children. That is the pinnacle of what it means to be good in that family structure. But modernity says that you also have to get educated. You also have to get a master's degree. Maybe you want a PhD. You need to get a good job. But by the time you turn 25, you have about 2 years to like date, marry, have kids, figure it all out, or you're considered a leftover woman. A total whiplash of a timeline. The timeline, of course, based on 1,000 years ago. And so this is one of the areas where there is this very specific grind between tradition and modernity. And at least in first-tier cities, you're seeing pushback. Interestingly, one of like the most popular shows of the last year or two is like a pun on a Confucian saying. It's 30, which means I'm just 30. I don't know what the actual English translation for it was, but it's a pun on the saying 32, which is the idea that when you turn 30, you're supposed to have established yourself. You're supposed to have worked yourself out in society. But of course, just as 40 is the new 30 around the world, in China, there is pushback around who are you supposed to be at 30? Is it the same as what it was supposed to be 1,000 years ago? What role do women play in this? And of course, most of the main characters in the show are women. So there is a total renegotiation, pretty direct renegotiation happening between modern women and Confucius.
That is amazing. So I'm tempted to end with that just because it's so great, but I do want to ask one more question. But that idea of, Sanshar Li and then Sanshar is quite incredible. But I want to end on a spiritual note, or kind of more spiritual, which is, I'm curious about the values, the fundamental value of Ren, benevolence, that Professor Chen talked about. we all know that China has been struggling ever since the Cultural Revolution with a kind of a struggle over what are the values and sort of reconstituting, values, because so much was destroyed during those years. So I'm really curious as to whether positive traditional values like Ren, like benevolence, and humanism, is that sort of taking hold once again in Chinese society? And is it something that people talk about at all, or is it really just kind of money, money, money?
Yeah, I think nowadays, really for many people, right, talks about money, 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 and but still, quite many people, even young people, as I know, they like to talk about Confucius virtues and including Ren. There are quite many people. For example, Harvard University, at Harvard University, the most popular class was Introduction to Computer Science. No surprise. And the second most popular class is Intro to Econ. No wonder. But the third most popular class is a surprise, and is classical Chinese philosophy. It's a class taught by Professor Puet, and with 700 students. Harvard did not have such a big classroom, so gave him a theater. Right? So it's very encouraging. And I teach a class, Confucian ethics, at Binghamton University. I don't have so many students, but I have excellent students. And a few years ago, I had a student, and she showed she showed familiarity with Confucius analysis passages. I asked her how many passages you can recite by memory, and she said the whole book. And I was so surprised. And she said because she attended a 读经学校 in China, this school focusing on reading classics. So, but currently I also have an excellent student. I think she's in the audience today, and she loves classical Chinese literature, loves classical Chinese philosophy, Confucianism and Buddhism, and she is teaching Chinese at a local school, local Catholic school. She teaches 10th grade Chinese, and she teaches these 10th grade students one Confucius sayings every day. And she said the students love it. So I think, well, we still have young people, so they are talking about they love Confucianism. The Confucian tradition always look pale or look weak, because without mass young people's attention and participation, right? But they are traditions, so they can always survive. One reason is young people will get older. so
Right, that's true.
Always there were people there to practice and support the tradition. Yeah.
So Zach, is Ren still relevant today? Benevolence?
I'd say yes, and it's more relevant than it was maybe even 10 or 15 years ago. I think of Confucianism as sort of a set of DNA. And one of my favorite sort of high school biology factoids is that in different scenarios and in different environments, different parts of your DNA can activate based on what sort of your environment is pressing a species to do over time. And I think China of the 80s and 90s needed 学and 孝, it needed study and filial piety and the order that came with that. But today, one of China's major features is that you have more and more people who are realizing that money isn't enough. I think back to my last train ride in China before I took a 2-week work trip to the United States that turned into a 1.5 years. And plastered on all of the, there was an advertisement on pretty much every single subway Dedao, one of the more popular platforms for information and podcasts and sort of self-improvement, was featuring a course on happiness beyond money. And it was everywhere, and there was state affiliation with it. And there's real recognition that, Deng famously talked about how in China's modern economy, there'd be winners and losers. The winners are building modern China, but the losers live there too. And I don't want to call people without money losers, but in strict economic terms, trying to figure out, for both the wealthy and not, what is this life for, when mere improving productivity is not your primary objective. I think Yuan really has its place there. And as a final thought, and as a bit of evidence for this, my last trip, one of my last trips in the States was to Harvard University's Divinity School. And I was sitting down with a friend of mine from China, actually who was in the book one way or another. And he was the very first Confucian scholar to be studying at Harvard Divinity School. He was the first person for whom the moral side of Confucianism this justified entry into Divinity School, which is of course characterized about preaching and understanding where religion fits into the modern world. So I think there's definitely, I've of course been tracking him back in China, and so I think there's definitely a place for the more moral side rather than just the structural side of Confucianism. And hopefully it'll be emphasized as a sort of salve against what has really been a grinding 20 or 30 years.
I love what you just said, that, it's sort of the sense that the time has come for benevolence and for Ren, that you needed xue and you needed xiao to, develop and modernize and all this stuff. And so now it's a moment of kind of rethinking and reckoning. And I just want to thank you both so much, because what could be a more perfect kickoff program for our series on In Search of China's Soul than tonight's discussion of Confucianism and the history and antiquity, the fundamental philosophies of Confucius, and then how they apply to China today and how people are grappling with, as Zach said, what is life for? Just amazing. I want to thank you both so much for joining us tonight, and we've all learned so much. So I'm thanking you on behalf of our entire audience. And this was I want you to know that this has been one of the most popular programs we've ever done. So thank you so much for doing this. And I also want to urge all of you next week, we have a whole bunch of great programs coming up. Next week, also linked to this question of In Search of China's Soul, on Wednesday, we're showing, people can watch Yellow Earth, Huang Tu Di, at home. And Yellow Earth was one of the most important films that came out in the mid 1980s that really changed the whole language of film following the Cultural Revolution. And the director, Chen Kai-ge, is going to be joining us next Wednesday in conversation with Janet Yang, who's a film producer in Hollywood, and Richard Pena, who's a great expert on film and a Chinese film aficionado. So it's a real moment and a very, very special thing that we're going to have Chen Kai-ge join us. So I urge you guys to join. It's also going to be talking about where is China, what are people in China thinking about, what is, again, the question of In Search of China's Soul. So please tune in. Thank you all so much. And we hope to bring you both back to our stage again soon and often. So thank you all so much. Good night.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Professor Chen. Thank you, Dinda.
Thank you, Zach.